Story number one. I've been driving trucks for 15 years, most of that time on the Southeast regional routes, and I've seen my share of strange things on the road. Lot lizards, midnight street racers, even some unexplainable lights in the sky over Tennessee. But nothing in all those miles quite prepared me for what happened during an overnight stay at a Purdue processing plant last summer. I had a 12-hour wait before my pickup, so I parked my bobtail next to a small pond where they let drivers rest between hauls. It was a quiet spot, set back from the main facility behind a row of scraggly pines, and I'd used it several times before without incident. After completing my pre-trip inspection and paperwork, I settled into my bunk around 3 p.m. The Georgia heat had been brutal that day, pushing past 95 degrees, so I kept my APU running to power the AC. I've always been good at sleeping in my truck. You have to be in this line of work. And I dozed off almost immediately, lulled by the steady hum of the unit and the occasional distant rumble of trucks on the main road. The first thing that caught my attention was a distinct tapping on my passenger side door around 3 a.m. It wasn't the sharp metallic ping of rain or the random thunk of windblown debris. This was deliberate, 3 quick taps in succession, like someone trying to get my attention. Thinking it might be another driver needing a lumper check or maybe one of the yard workers with a question about my paperwork, I peered out the window, but there was no one there. The security lights cast long shadows across the lot, but I had a clear view of the empty space beside my truck. I checked my mirrors too. Nothing. I brushed it off and lay back down, figuring maybe a branch had blown against the cab. The moment my head hit the pillow, the tapping started again, this time on the driver's side. I jumped up to look, but again, nothing. The lot was still empty, though I noticed the wind had picked up, making the pines sway. Something felt off about the whole situation, so I double-checked my locks and opened the side hatches to better hear what was going on outside. After 15 minutes of tense silence, broken only by the hum of my APU, I heard it. A soft splat, splat, splat moving along the driver's side of my truck, like wet feet on pavement. The sound was methodical, almost purposeful, working its way from the back of the cab toward the front. I waited in complete stillness, determined to catch whoever was messing with me. The splats continued, getting closer to the cab, accompanied by a strange rustling sound that reminded me of feathers in the wind. Then came a heavy thud from directly above me. Something had landed on the roof. Heart pounding, I grabbed my tire thumper and stood perfectly still, listening to whatever was up there moving around. The footsteps, if that's what they were, moved from one side of the cab to the other. Too heavy to be a small animal, but too light for a person. What happened next would have been funny if I hadn't been so wound up. A large Canadian goose tumbled off the roof and landed right on my hood, catching itself with an awkward flap of its wings. It stood there, regaining its balance, and turned to look directly at me through the windshield. Its eyes caught the security lights, reflecting back with an unsettling orange glow that seemed to pulse slightly in the darkness. As we made eye contact, the tapping at my door started again, more insistent this time. Frustrated and a bit embarrassed, I yanked open my driver's side door, tire thumper still in hand. Another goose waddled away as fast as its legs could carry it, honking frantically like a kid who'd just found the horn on a new bicycle. Looking around, I noticed dozens of geese by the pond, all seemingly interested in my truck. Their heads turned in unison to watch me, and in the harsh glare of the security lights, I could swear some of them were larger than any Canadian geese I'd ever seen. The rest of the night was a series of pecking, waddling, and thudding as these birds took turns investigating my truck. I tried to sleep, but every few minutes they'd start up again, landing on the roof, pecking at the doors, or just standing there staring through my windows with those glowing eyes. I've dealt with plenty of wildlife on overnight stays before. Raccoons, deer, even a black bear once up in Virginia. But something about their behavior felt wrong. They moved too purposefully, too coordinated, like they were following some kind of pattern I couldn't quite grasp. But here's the thing that still bothers me. When I mentioned it to the shipping clerk during checkout the next morning, he looked at me strangely and said they drained that pond months ago because of bird problems. Something about contamination in the water. When I walked back to check, he was right. The pond was bone dry, Nothing but cracked earth all the way across, without a single goose in sight. The only traces I could find were some odd, webbed prints in the mud near my truck. Prints that seemed to lead nowhere at all, as if whatever made them had simply vanished into thin air. Story number 2. I've spent 12 years hauling hotshot freight across the Great Plains, and you get used to certain things in this line of work. The endless horizon that plays tricks on your eyes. The way time seems to stretch like taffy between midnight and dawn. The road hypnosis that creeps in when you've been staring at those broken white lines for too many hours. But what happened to me last August on a remote stretch of North Dakota highway still makes me question everything I thought I knew about night driving. I was pushing hard to reach Montana by morning, hauling a critical tractor part worth more than my yearly take-home. Some desperate farmer was counting on me to save his harvest, and I've always taken pride in never letting a client down. The digital clock on my dash read 2:17 a.m. when I first noticed the highway hypnosis setting in. That familiar sensation where your mind starts to drift, despite your best efforts to stay alert. Anyone who's driven through North Dakota knows it's a special kind of flat out there. The kind of flat where you can watch your dog run away for 3 days, as the old truckers say. The roads stretch out ruler straight to the horizon, and on clear nights, you can spot anything on the asphalt from half a mile away. That's why I was so puzzled when I first saw it, a long, dark shape spanning my entire lane about a half mile ahead. I eased off the accelerator, thinking it was probably some blown truck tire treads. We see those all the time, steel belts waiting to wreak havoc on someone's undercarriage. But as the distance closed, my high beams caught something that made my blood run cold. It wasn't tire debris at all. It was 2 people lying head to toe across the lane, perfectly still, like they'd been arranged that way. I swerved into the opposite lane, the load shifting slightly in my trailer. My mind was racing, trying to process what I'd just seen. The rational part of me said I needed to back up and check on them. They could be hurt or worse. But then I remembered something that saved my life that night. Years ago, an old graybeard driver had pulled me aside at a truck stop in Wyoming. He'd heard I was running the northern routes and wanted to warn me about something he'd encountered back in the 90s. He told me about people who would lie in the road, waiting for some good Samaritan to stop and help. Then their friends would emerge from the darkness and overwhelm the driver, stealing their vehicle and leaving them stranded, or worse. I decided not to back up. Through my mirrors, I watched as both figures slowly stood when they realized I was pulling away. They moved with an unnatural synchronization that still haunts me, rising in perfect unison like marionettes pulled by the same string. They turned toward the shoulder of the road, but something about their movement was wrong. Instead of walking, they seemed to glide, their feet never quite touching the ground. I called the state police once I had cell service again, but I knew how it would play out. The nearest patrol car was probably an hour away, and those figures would be long gone by then. I gave my report anyway, telling myself I'd done the right thing. 2 weeks later, I was back at that truck stop in Wyoming, and I went looking for that old graybeard to thank him. None of the regulars had heard of him. The waitress, who'd been there 20 years, said she'd never seen anyone matching his description. When I described his truck, a distinctive purple Peterbilt with chrome stacks, she just shook her head. But here's the detail that still keeps me awake some nights. I looked up accident reports for that stretch of highway, curious about similar incidents. In 1992, 2 men were killed there when they tried to rob a trucker. According to the report, they were lying in the road when the driver, perhaps not seeing them in time, ran them over. The driver was never found. What bothers me most isn't the thought that I might have encountered some modern-day highway robbers. It's the fact that in my rearview mirror that night, as those figures glided toward the shoulder, I could see the road through their bodies. And when I passed that spot on my return trip 3 days later, I found 2 dark stains on the asphalt, head to toe, exactly where they had been lying. The police report said those stains had been there for 30 years, impossible to remove despite multiple attempts to resurface that stretch of road. These days, I don't drive the northern routes anymore. The money's not worth it. I wonder about that old graybeard who warned me, though. Story number 3. 15 years of solo trucking teaches you that the real dangers are mundane. Black ice, blown tires, dozy drivers crossing the center line. But something happened to me last October that changed how I think about lonely places after dark. I still can't explain it, but I know what I saw, or rather, what I stopped seeing. I pulled off onto a quiet exit ramp around 3 a.m., settling in for my mandatory 10-hour rest period. It was one of those clear autumn nights where the moon hangs so bright and full, it seems like you could reach up and touch it. The kind of night that makes everything look slightly wrong, like you're seeing the world through a filter that changes all the rules about shadows and depth. The exit was flanked by harvested cornfields, brown stalks cut down to stubble that rustled in the occasional breeze. I was doing my usual safety check before bedding down, walking the perimeter, checking my seals, making sure I was well off the shoulder, when I spotted it. There was an unmistakably human figure standing motionless in the field to my right, maybe 50 yards out. The moonlight gave me a clear view, and there was no mistaking the human shape: head, shoulders, arms at its sides. I wasn't particularly spooked at first. Farmers work all hours during harvest season, and I figured some old-timer was putting up a scarecrow, maybe trying to keep the deer away from whatever winter crop they had planned. Sure, 3 a.m. seemed odd, but I've seen farmers do stranger things. I climbed into my sleeper cab and pulled up some YouTube videos on my phone, trying to wind down from the long haul. That's when I caught movement in my peripheral vision. Just a flicker, but enough to make me pause my video. I clicked off my interior lights to get a better view through the windows. The figure was still there in the field, but something felt different. I studied it for a long moment, trying to figure out what had changed. Then it hit me. The figure seemed closer than before, and slightly turned, like it had shifted its stance. But that had to be my imagination, right? The moon playing tricks with shadows as it moved across the sky. The highway was almost completely deserted, with maybe one car passing every 10 minutes or so. Each set of headlights swept across the field, briefly illuminating the figure before plunging it back into moonlit darkness. I kept telling myself it was just a scarecrow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that its position was slightly different after each passing car, like some twisted game of red light, green light. Around 4 a.m., nature called. I considered using an empty bottle. Every driver keeps a few handy for emergencies, but I felt ridiculous letting myself get spooked by a farmer's scarecrow. I did one more check through my windows. The figure was exactly where it had been, standing silent in the field. Still, I made sure my brake lock was engaged and grabbed my flashlight before hopping out. I walked around to the gap between my truck and trailer, the gravel crunching under my boots. The air was colder than I expected, carrying that sharp autumn bite that makes every sound seem louder. As I stood there taking care of business, every instinct screamed at me to keep my eyes forward, to not look out into that field. We all know that feeling, the one that makes you walk a little faster up the basement stairs, that makes you avoid mirrors in dark rooms. But human nature is a funny thing. The more you tell yourself not to look, the more you need to. I tried to resist, but finally I had to turn my head. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness to where the figure had been standing. The field was empty. My stomach dropped as if the ground had disappeared beneath my feet. The corn stubble stretched out unbroken in every direction, silvery in the moonlight. No figure, no scarecrow, no entrance or exit points where someone could have walked away. Just empty fields all the way to the tree line a quarter-mile back. I don't remember finishing up or climbing back into my cab. I just remember throwing my truck into gear and pulling out onto the highway, not even bothering to log it properly. I drove 40 minutes to the nearest Love's truck stop, where the bright lights and crowd of other trucks made the whole thing seem ridiculous. But I wrote up my violation report the next day without a single regret. These days, I stick to proper truck stops and populated rest areas, no matter how tired I am. The extra fuel spent finding them is worth it. Story number 4. In this business, you learn to trust your instincts. 17 years of hauling flatbed across the Southeast taught me that some things just feel wrong, even if you can't explain why. But nothing in all those miles prepared me for what happened on a backwoods Tennessee road in the summer of 2006. I'd picked up a load of construction materials somewhere in the triangle between Memphis, Nashville, and the state lines of Mississippi and Alabama. The kind of rural shipping point where the directions include turn left at the big oak tree. The load needed tarping, so I'd strapped everything down and covered it before pulling out. About 5 miles down a 2-lane road that twisted through dense forest, I noticed my tarp flapping in the wind. Any flatbed driver will tell you that's a sound that sets your teeth on edge. A loose tarp can cost you hours of work and thousands in damaged freight. I found a wide shoulder and pulled over, figuring I'd better fix it before I hit the main highway. As I climbed up to inspect the situation, it became clear I'd done a rush job from the start. The whole thing needed redoing. I started undoing the bungee straps and rolling back the tarps, mentally kicking myself for not taking more time at the shipper. That's when I saw him, a lone figure walking along the shoulder in my direction. Nothing too unusual about that, though something in the back of my mind noted how strange it was to see anyone walking out here, miles from anywhere. I kept working but found myself glancing up more frequently as he got closer. The sun was high overhead, but the tree canopy cast strange, shifting shadows across the road. When he was about 50 feet away, details started jumping out at me. His hair looked like someone had attacked it with dull scissors during an earthquake. A patchy mullet that would have been funny if it hadn't been so unsettling. But it was his eyes that really got to me. They were clear, not glazed like you'd expect from someone drunk or high, but somehow wrong, like you could look straight through them and not find anyone home. His clothes were filthy, hanging off him at odd angles. One tennis shoe was missing its laces, the tongue lolling out like a dead thing. He stopped beside my trailer and waited until I looked at him directly. "I've got a long walk," he said, his voice flat and emotionless. I gave him the standard response about how far we were from anywhere, making it clear I wasn't offering a ride. He nodded and started walking past, but stopped at my driver's door and turned back. "I've got a long walk," he repeated, exactly the same tone, like a recording being played back. I explained about insurance regulations, apologized for not being able to help. He seemed to accept this and moved on. I waited until he was a good distance away before returning to my tarps, but kept him in my peripheral vision. The woods seemed quieter now. No birds, no insects, just the rustle of leaves in the breeze. When I looked up again to check his position, he had turned around and was heading back toward my truck. His hand was raised to his face like he was talking on a phone, gesturing animatedly with his other hand. But something about the movement seemed wrong, mechanical, like a wind-up toy following its programming. I grabbed my winch bar, 8 pounds of solid steel that saved me from more than one bad situation, and climbed into my cab. Through the windshield, I could now see he wasn't holding a phone at all. He was talking into his empty hand, and whatever conversation he was having wasn't pleasant. His face had contorted into a mask of rage, lips moving rapidly as he argued with nothing. I locked my doors and set the winch bar on the passenger seat, cranking the engine without even checking for traffic. As I pulled past him, our eyes met. His face had gone completely blank, hands still raised to his ear, and in that moment, I swear the shadows around him seemed to bend the wrong way, like they were being pulled toward him. I hit the gas hard, working through the gears as fast as I could. When I finally checked my mirror around 6th gear, the road behind me was empty. Not just empty of the strange man, empty of shadows, empty of anything that suggested anyone had been there at all. 2 weeks later, I had to deliver to that same area. I mentioned the incident to the shipping clerk, describing the man with the mangled mullet. The color drained from his face. He told me that 20 years ago, a mental patient had escaped from a facility about 30 miles away. They found his body beside that same stretch of road, clutching a phone that hadn't worked in years. Apparently, he'd been telling people about his long walk home. These days, I avoid that particular route, even if it means adding miles to my trip. But sometimes when I'm driving other back roads and see someone walking alone, I check my mirror after I pass them, just to make sure they cast a shadow. Story number 5. Every long-haul driver crossing eastern Washington knows the unofficial parking spots, those wide gravel turnouts that break up the endless wheat fields. After 15 years hauling loads between Seattle and Missoula, I knew each one by distance markers and landmarks. My favorite was the one on Route 12 past the abandoned Foster grain elevator, far enough from the highway that the rare passing truck wouldn't wake me. Last September, that spot taught me why some drivers prefer the crowded rest areas, despite the constant noise and reefer units cycling all night. The night started normally. I'd pulled in around 10, the gravel crunching under my 18 wheels as I backed my Peterbilt against the field for a better view of any approaching vehicles. The spot was empty as usual. Most drivers avoid these turnouts after dark, especially since the state started closing the smaller rest areas and more trucks crowded onto the main routes. With my pre-trip already logged for tomorrow and my electronic logs updated, I closed the blackout curtains, killed the marker lights, and settled in with my tablet to watch some Netflix before sleep. The first click came at 11:47. I remember checking my phone's display when I heard it. Someone was definitely trying my driver's side door handle. In 15 years, I'd never had lot lizards out this far from the interstate, and my CB had been silent for the last hour except for occasional skip from the Montana side. No engine sounds, no headlights reflecting off my mirrors, just that distinct sound of my handle being tested. I muted my tablet, listening hard through the silence broken only by the light whisper of wind through my antennas. The handle clicked again, but this time from the passenger side. Training kicked in. I reached for the curtain, keeping my movements slow and silent. No point advertising that I was awake if someone was actually out there. My right hand found the mag light I keep between the seats, while my left eased the fabric back just enough to see out. The LED spots I'd installed last summer showed nothing but empty gravel and wheat stalks swaying in the wind. I powered up the engine anyway, standard procedure when something feels off. The bright halogen floods lit up 50 yards in every direction, reflecting off the grain elevator's broken windows in the distance. Nothing. No vehicles, no movement. Not even tire tracks in the gravel where someone might have walked up. I kept the engine idling and did another sweep with my flashlight, checking my mirrors for movement behind the trailer. The September wind was picking up, whistling through the wheat field behind me and making the stalks dance like waves on a dark ocean. That's what I tried telling myself when I heard the next sound, something metallic dragging along my driver's side, like fingers trailing across the panels. The handle clicking started again, but different now. Both sides at once, perfectly synchronized, testing every latch on my cab with mechanical precision. The whole truck shifted suddenly, airbags hissing as weight moved across the hood. More clicking above me, like something testing the roof vents and the seams around my sleeper windows. In my mirrors, I could see my suspension dipping and rising, adjusting to movement I couldn't identify. Years of experience told me exactly how much weight it would take to make my rig move like that. At least several hundred pounds distributed across multiple points. The movement tracked across my roof like careful footsteps, but wider than any human stride. I hit the panic button, but the alarm's wail just became background noise to what happened next. The clicking spread to every handle, latch, and vent simultaneously. Hundreds of tiny impacts rattled across my cab, like someone drumming their fingers across every surface at once. The windows flexed inward with dull thuds, the rubber seals creaking under pressure. My CB crackled with static despite being turned off, and the electrical system flickered, making my gauges dance. Everything stopped the instant another truck's headlights swept across my mirrors. Complete silence except for my engine's idle and the wind. I sat motionless, watching that truck's taillight shrink to pinpoints through my side mirror, waiting for whatever was out there to return. Nothing else happened for the rest of the night, but I didn't even consider sleeping. I kept my engine running until dawn, watching the wheat field move in patterns that didn't match the wind. Dawn revealed my truck covered in perfect tiny handprints, not smudges or dirt. Actual prints, like tiny fingers, had pressed against every inch of glass. They were too small to be human, each one barely bigger than a quarter. The morning sun burned them away within minutes, leaving only clean glass and the endless wheat stretching to the horizon. Story number 6. The endless stretch of I-70 through Kansas was familiar territory after 15 years of long-haul driving. I'd seen my share of strange things on overnight runs. Wildlife, weather phenomena, even the occasional confused driver going the wrong way. Usually the monotony of corn and wheat fields helped the miles slide by peacefully, but something about this particular night run felt different from the moment I noticed that motorhome. The air felt heavy that night, like just before a storm, though the weather report had promised clear skies all the way to Colorado. It was a beat-up RV, probably from the early 90s, with weathered beige paint peeling around the edges and rust spots blooming along the wheel wells. The first time it passed me, I barely registered it beyond noting the unusual number of faces pressed against the windows. 5 or 6 people, all staring intently at my truck as they went by. Something about their expressions made me adjust my mirrors, but I couldn't place why. They weren't the usual curious kids waving at a big rig or tired travelers glancing over. These faces were eerily still, focused entirely on my cab with an intensity that made me check my speed. I watched them merge back into my lane through my driver's side mirror, noting how the RV seemed to wobble slightly, like it wasn't quite touching the road properly. About 40 minutes later, that same RV passed me again. The night was clear, stars scattered across the Kansas sky like diamond dust, making it easy to recognize the vehicle's distinct silhouette. This time I got a better look at the passengers. They had long, unkempt hair and hollow-looking eyes, all fixed on my truck with an unsettling focus. Their skin seemed too pale in my headlights, almost translucent. I glanced at my GPS, realizing there hadn't been any rest stops or exits where they could have pulled over to let me pass them. The westbound stretch was empty except for my truck and their RV, and I hadn't stopped or slowed down. My GPS screen flickered each time I looked at it, the estimated arrival time jumping between numbers that didn't make sense. I radioed a few other drivers, asking if anyone had seen a beige motorhome. The channel stayed quiet except for static, which was unusual for this popular route. My dash cam was running as always, its small red light a reassuring presence on my console. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see those faces materialize in the darkness behind me. The temperature gauge on my dashboard started fluctuating wildly, dropping 10 degrees every time I thought I saw the RV's headlights in my mirrors. The third pass defied explanation. We were in the middle of a 100-mile stretch with no services, no exits, and no shoulder wide enough for an RV to safely pull over. The speed limit was 75, and I'd been holding steady at 70 with my cruise control. Yet here they were again, emerging from the darkness behind me, like they'd been waiting in some invisible pocket of road I couldn't see. The RV's engine made no sound as it approached. I realized this only after it was alongside me. As they drew even with my cab, I counted the faces. 7 this time, though the RV had only seemed big enough for 5 or 6 people. Their eyes tracked me in unison as they passed, and in my mirror I caught a glimpse of something that made me question my sanity. For a fraction of a second, the RV's taillights seemed to float several feet above the pavement, and through its chassis, I could see the stars. My hands were steady on the wheel. I'd done this route hundreds of times before, but my mind was racing. I'd heard stories from other drivers about strange things on this stretch of Interstate 70, usually dismissed as fatigue or imagination. Looking at my fuel gauge, I noticed something odd. Despite driving for nearly 2 hours, my fuel level hadn't dropped as much as it should have. The needle kept jumping between full and empty, though my engine never stuttered. I pulled into the TA truck stop in Lyman and parked for the night, making sure to back in where I could see all approaching vehicles. The lot was half full of other trucks, their diesel engines ticking as they cooled down. The RV never appeared in the lot, and I never saw it again on that stretch of I-70. When I checked my logbook the next morning, the entries showed I'd covered that 100-mile stretch in exactly 60 minutes. Perfect time at 70 miles per hour with no passing RV recorded on my dash cam. But when I reviewed my fuel receipts, something caught my eye. According to the timestamps, I'd somehow covered 147 miles on that stretch of road that's only supposed to be 100 miles long. The GPS data from that night was corrupted, showing my truck in 3 different locations at the exact same time. Now I always check my mirrors a little more carefully when I pass through Kansas at night. Sometimes when the stars are particularly bright and the road stretches empty before me, I catch myself counting the faces in passing vehicles, making sure the numbers add up. Thanks for watching. Don't leave before leaving a like to this video. Also hit the subscribe button to support my work. And as always, have a horrific nightmare, my dear.